One second and we will be ready. Good morning, Melanie Phillips. How are you today?
Good morning, Abby. Very well, thank you. Nice to see you again.
Always a pleasure. And again, we get to discuss finally the actual visit of Prince Williams in Israel, which was supposed to be an apolitical visit. And I'd love to hear your thoughts now that it is over and we know exactly what transpired. So shoot away, Melanie. What do you think? How was it?
Well, as I think we remarked when we last spoke about the subject, it was never likely that a visit by a British royal family member to that region could be apolitical. And it was not apolitical, but my goodness, both the governments of Israel and Great Britain went to enormous lengths to pretend that it was apolitical. The reason why it wasn't apolitical was the way it was framed by the British Foreign Office, and the way in which, in particular, Prince William's visit to the Palestinian Authority was framed, and within that, to Jerusalem. And I say that because, as we discussed last week, the advance itinerary of Prince William placed the old city of Jerusalem within what the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office calls the occupied Palestinian territories. And when he actually went to Jerusalem, he visited the Western Wall, he visited Temple Mount. And as far as I could see, when he went onto Temple Mount, which is the holiest place in Judaism, as far as I could see, he was unaccompanied by a Jew. He went with Arabs, with Muslims, who explained to him and guided him around Temple Mount. In other words, the narrative, to use the fashionable term, with which he was presented at Temple Mount was not the Jewish narrative. It was the Arab-Muslim narrative under the supervision of the British Foreign Office. And that's how they wanted it, because that's how they perceive that part of Jerusalem as not being part of Israel. And so the messages to me were mixed, because on the one hand, it was a great event, as the British Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis remarked in an article he wrote for the British Telegraph newspaper a few days ago. It's a great event to see a member of the British royal family stand at the Western Wall, bow his head, place his hands on the sacred stones, and so forth and so on. And that is a very powerful symbol of a recognition of what the Western Wall means in Judaism, and thereby, by extension, what the temple means in Judaism, and by extension, therefore, what the whole of Jerusalem means in Judaism. Unfortunately, that message was made ambiguous by the way it was framed by the Foreign Office to position the old city in its entirety within what's called the occupied Palestinian territories. And as I have already said, and as I've written on my website, melaniephillips.com, this phrase is actually a falsehood, because there never were any Palestinian territories, because there were never any Palestinians in antiquity, and there was never a place called Palestine as a sovereign nation, and there was no occupation, because the idea that there is an occupation is a willful misunderstanding and misreading of the relevant treaties under international law which define what an occupation is. Crucially, you need to have a sovereign country that was occupied, and the whole of the disputed territories were never a sovereign country. And indeed, going back to the 1920s, it was promised to the Jews alone that they would have the right of settlement within all that territory. So the way the British Foreign Office continues to frame this is wrong. It is mischievous. It is politically driven, ideological. And unfortunately, that's the way in which Prince William's visit was framed. There was something else which jarred with me very badly, when he went to Ramallah and he met with the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, okay, so he's going there, and therefore, you know, he has to observe the diplomatic niceties. He has to make small talk. He has to be gracious to Abbas. So much is understood. But what he said was, and I don't have the specific quote in front of me, so I'm talking from memory, but what he said was Prince William, was delighted that the relationship between our two countries was as strong as it was. Now, this leapt out at me. Our two countries, what is the second country? The first, obviously, is Great Britain. The second country is Palestine. In other words, since Prince William only speaks to lines which are given him by the Foreign Office, only uses terms which are given him by the Foreign Office, it would appear that the British government now recognises a country called Palestine. Has anyone told the British Prime Minister, Mrs. May? I'm sure she doesn't know. And what was even more striking was that there was virtually no comment about any of this. It was as if the Israel government and the British government were in a kind of collusion to keep Prince William's visit apolitical. And I read somewhere that the Israel government had made a decision not to mention this blooper by Prince William when he said, he referred to our countries, our two countries, because quite clearly they wanted to keep the show on the road. The show was, you know, it had to give one message, which was after 70 years, the unofficial British Foreign Office boycott of the State of Israel has come to an end. A member of the British royal family, the second in line to the throne, has come and bestowed Britain's imprimatur upon the State of Israel. And that's a great event. And that is a great event. And given the history, the fraught history of the ambiguous and fraught history of the relationship between the United Kingdom and the Jewish homeland in the State of Israel, no question, but it was a very significant move, a right move, a welcome move, and no question but that Britain wants a very strong relationship with the State of Israel. It wants a strong relationship in trade, in high tech, in science, in intelligence sharing. All these things are good and not to be sneered at, but it kind of parcels out into a separate compartment, the politics. And the politics stink, because the politics don't just line up the United Kingdom with the Palestinians' agenda of claiming East Jerusalem as their capital of a future state of Palestine. It doesn't just therefore line up Britain with what I consider to be a rejectionist agenda, because the state of Palestine is wanted not to live side by side with Israel, but as a means of destroying Israel. But much worse than that, the whole Palestinian Arab Muslim narrative about Jerusalem and about Temple Mount and all of that is to write the Jews out of our own history in Jerusalem and to negate Judaism's most sacred story about itself, which is centered around Jerusalem and the temple. And that's what the British government inadvertently is doing. It is lending credibility to the agenda of writing the Jews out of their own Jewish history. And that is a terrible thing. And of course, the British don't see it that way, because the British official mind doesn't see the Jews as a nation in its own country. It doesn't as of antiquity, it doesn't understand or accept or acknowledge the importance of the religious link. It doesn't accept or acknowledge that for Jews alone, the people, the religion, and the land are indistinguishable. And that makes the Jews and Judaism unique in the world. All these things the British will not acknowledge. And consequently, the notion that this visit by Prince William was something unequivocally to celebrate, and that British Jews in particular are, beside themselves with joy over this, as was suggested in the article written by the chief rabbi, is only partially true. Yes, British Jews are delighted generally by Prince William's visit for all those reasons, but those of us who look below the surface of the rah-rah see something very troubling which remains in the British attitude towards Israel.
Following the thought process that you're giving across here, including the fact that Israel consciously stayed away from making any controversial statements to make this visit not look good, there was one thing that really went under the radar. I don't even know if you heard about it, but the mayor of Jerusalem was in contact with Prince William or his entourage, whatever, about meeting him. And they said yes, but not in Jerusalem.
Yes, I did notice that. I mean, and Nir Barkat, the mayor of Jerusalem, said, if you're not meeting me in Jerusalem, you'll meet me nowhere. And Correct. He refused to go to the reception on apparently neutral territory, wherever that was, to which he'd been invited.
Embassy in Ramat Gan, I think. Yes.
I think that's right. Well, good for him. Good for him. That's entirely the right attitude. And I would like to see the Israel government take that attitude towards Britain much more robustly, because this is really appalling stuff. I mean, it's one thing to say, Jerusalem should be divided. We support a two-state solution. And in a future state of Palestine, East Jerusalem should be part of that, should be the capital of such a state of Palestine. In fact, the British don't even say that. They simply say they think they approve of they support a two-state solution, and that Jerusalem has to be divided. Separately, but relatedly, they don't recognize, this is the crucial point, they don't recognize the Jewish claim to Jerusalem at all. That's the point. It's not simply that they are annoyed with Israel for laying claim to a bit of the city that they think should be left open for negotiation. That's one thing, but they don't say that. Their position is based on the fact that, as they see it, Jerusalem is not in Israel, and Jerusalem should not be in Israel at all. And therefore, the claim that any part of Jerusalem is Israel's capital is one that they have never accepted. Now, as I say, that goes far, far beyond a position, however contentious that position might be, in terms of a two-state solution and how that would look on the ground. This is actually absolutely fundamental. This is the Muslim world, the Arabs' position that the Jews have no place in Jerusalem at all. That is the position. That's what all this stuff about Temple Mount means. And consequently, not even to acknowledge, to go to the lengths of saying we are not going to meet the mayor of Jerusalem in Jerusalem, because that might imply that the Jews actually are entitled to be there, and that the mayor of Jerusalem, Israel, is the mayor of Jerusalem, Israel. I mean, that is a terrible thing to have done. And it's these gestures, which are more than gestures, which I think undercut the message that is a true message, that it was a very historic visit by Prince William. And there's no question but that the British government wants to be, a friend of Israel, but a friend of Israel on certain terms. And those terms are intellectually absurd, historically illiterate, and politically malevolent. And I would hope that Israel's government, Israel's prime minister, is saying that, because for sure they chose not to say it in public when Prince William was there.
Following this whole train of thought, correct me if I'm wrong, wouldn't this have been a fabulous opportunity for Prince William to have given some attention to the 100-year anniversary of the Balfour Declaration and Britain's historic involvement and promise of there one day being a Jewish state for the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, even though they then basically reneged on it?
Well, there you are. You see, he didn't do that, and he wouldn't do that because the British, the Balfour Declaration was the declaration by the British government. And virtually before the ink was dry, Britain tried to get out of it. Not the government at the time, the officials, the administration in mandatory Palestine. It was a shameful, shameful, shameful story. And over the subsequent decades, the British government reneged on that declaration and turned what was a binding international promise, legal promise to settle the Jews throughout mandatory Palestine in order to create a Jewish homeland. They turned that into a pledge to create in that territory an Arab state, another Arab state. That was the story of the Balfour Declaration's subsequent progress. And consequently, the British will go to great lengths to avoid speaking about the Balfour Declaration. I mean, they had no option but to mention it and to celebrate it on the anniversary. But that's it. It's like they never want to speak about it again. And this is the ambiguity at the heart of Britain's attitude to Israel. Now it's here. Let's trade with it. Great stuff. They're doing great stuff, and we can all be happy trading and high-teching and scientific exchanges and fantastic. But let's not talk about what it actually means to be a Jewish state, because that is far too difficult. As I've said before, I think Britain may now be at the point of being left behind by the rest of the world, not just because in the White House now, there is an unambiguous supporter, not just of the state of Israel and its high tech and trade, but of the existence of the state of Israel and what it means in President Trump. But also because, as we can see, and we've talked about this before, the Arab world has changed. The Gulf states led by Saudi Arabia, they still have difficulties with Israel, no question. They still have difficulties with the Jewish people, no question. However, they have a common enemy in Iran, and they are now in a tacit alliance with Israel over Iran. And we can see in the attempts to bring about some sort of peace plan progress by the United States, we can see that because the Palestinian Arabs are refusing to take part in that process, they are being told in no uncertain terms by Saudi Arabia that they're over. The Arab world will not come to their assistance anymore. Just get on with it, Palestinian Arabs is what they're saying to them, and accept the deal. And of course they won't. That's another story. So one is finding that Britain and the EU, because the EU remains implacably hostile to Israel while trading with it, Britain is kind of on the wrong side here. I mean, Britain is in danger of becoming Britain and the EU are in danger of becoming the Palestinian Arabs' sole remaining cheerleaders in the world, while America and the Arab world moves on to other things. So politically, it seems to me baffling, quite frankly, that Britain continues with this policy. I don't really understand it. To say it's anti-Semitism, I think, is a facile explanation too readily trotted out. So I remain perplexed.
Well, final question, or actually final issue about the Prince William visit, and then we'll move on. Interestingly enough, there was one headline that really was not given any attention in the mainstream Western media, even in Israeli media. But I found it in Arabic media, and then we put it up on our IsraelUnwired.com website, which is that Prince William's convoy was stoned by the Palestinian Arabs when he was driving past or near Ramallah. Any thoughts on that incident not being really given any attention.
Well, like you, I read some references to it, but they seem to be coming solely from the Arab media, which means one of two things. Either it wasn't true, or Israel, for similar reasons, the ones we've been discussing, chose to ignore it because it would have kind of, just interrupted the narrative of an apolitical tour by Prince William. If it did happen, then it's quite interesting because what it means is that either the Palestinian Arab leadership kind of condoned it and even encouraged it, or that they can't control it. Either way, it's quite interesting that it's sort of out of control. And it's even more interesting if they kind of turned a blind eye as a kind of gesture that tells Britain, you think we've gone away, think again. Who knows? I've no idea what happened there. But if the Israeli, I mean, you're right. The Israeli media, as far as I can see, apart from your own website, the mainstream media did not report it, and you'd think they would have done. So I don't know.
The interesting thing about the reporting, again, this is as it was reported in the Arab media, the excuse they gave, they have quoted the leaders of it happened in a refugee camp outside of Ramallah, and the leaders of that refugee camp said, well, we didn't know that the convoy would pass through here. We didn't tell the people. We didn't prepare them until this morning. Meaning they were trying to give an excuse. Had we prepared them ahead of time to behave properly, it would not have happened.
Well, what an amazing coincidence that was, that they happened to be thinking, or they happened to wake up that morning thinking, we'll throw some stones at passing cars. And it just happened to be Prince William's convoy.
Correct.
What an amazing coincidence.
Correct. All right, on to the other major news, which again isn't getting that much headlines, even though I think it should. But the protests in Iran, the mass civilian protests in the streets of Iran, not only because of the economic situation, but now there's a water shortage or dirty water going on all over the place. What insight do you have in what we're witnessing?
Well, I think it's terribly important. The one hope one has and has always had about Iran is that the way to avoid catastrophe by Iran, becoming a nuclear power, becoming so powerful that it causes terrible war in the region and the world. The one way to avoid that catastrophe is for the regime to be brought down. And the only way the regime can realistically be brought down is by the people rising up. And in Iran, you have a people who are basically, overall, really good people. They have been historically friends of the West. They are civilized, they are cultured, they are educated, they are pacific. They're decent people, and they have been ruled for several decades now by this appalling fanatical Islamic regime. And they've never wanted it. They don't like it. They, realized they made a terrible mistake quite soon after Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. And they've been stuck. And, years back, there was an attempt, I think it was called the Green Revolution. There was an attempt by the people to rise up. And at that point, it was tragic and terrible that the West abandoned them. It didn't do anything to help them. And they were therefore crushed. If you are going to have a revolt, if the people are going to revolt successfully against tyrannical regimes that rule them, then it's absolutely crucial that they are backed to the hilt by the free world, backed in every sense, backed in terms of material help. And these days, that material help very largely concerns the ability for such people to communicate with each other electronically. Ways have to be found of circumventing the blocking mechanisms that the regime uses to block the ability of the people to talk to each other in order to foment the revolution. So the free world has to help materially. And just as important, in my view, it has to help psychologically and emotionally. Because if you are going to have a people rising up against its tyrannical rulers, that will mean that some of them will die. And they will not do that, however brave they are. They will not do that if they think it's doomed to failure. They will only do it if they think there is a realistic chance of success. And if you have the free world being silent, then they have no way of keeping their morale up to the point where they can keep going. So the help and assistance and backing and support of the free world is crucial. We saw that with the Soviet Union, absolutely crucial. Those dissidents were supported insofar as the West could support them. There were rallies, there were protests in the West, there were great movements of support, there were parcels, there was parcels and posts going to and from the dissidents, smuggled out, smuggled in. A tremendous smuggling network of support arose in the West. Now, in my view, that was absolutely central in enabling those people to carry on. That hasn't happened with Iran until very recently. There's been virtually no support from the West. On the contrary, the West, in the form of the Iran nuclear deal, has actually supported and empowered the regime. How terrible is that? So now we have a different situation. Now we have President Trump in the White House torn up the Iran nuclear deal, still backed to the hilt by Britain and Europe. But nevertheless, the important country, America, has said enough, reimposed swingeing sanctions. The rial, the Iranian currency, has been in free fall for some time. The Iranian economy is being strangled. The people are rising up against the economic privations, but also, crucially, against the regime. And that's been clear for a long time now. You've got women tearing off their hijabs. You've got people saying, death to the Ayatollahs, death to the regime. And crucially, most interestingly, the other day was it, I saw a demonstration in the last few days where the crowd was shouting, death to Palestine. Death to Palestine? I mean, this is a genocidal regime whose stated aim is to wipe out the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And the people of Iran are shouting, death to Palestine. In other words, the support of the Iranian regime for the Palestinian Arabs is one that they want to stop completely. They don't want to support the Palestinian Arabs. And this has been not reported. I mean, it's wicked, wicked stuff. But in Britain, it's had virtually no reporting. I mean, one or two reports, but virtually none. Certainly nothing commensurate with the significance of these gathering protests. And we find today there are reports of the Iranian people being shot at. So, if there is actual violence, if people start to die, then the West will start to report it. But my goodness, it's weak stuff. And that's because the received wisdom, certainly in Britain, is that the only threat Iran poses to the world is if lunatics like President Trump and the State of Israel start bombing it. That's been the received wisdom in Britain for years, that Iran poses no threat to anybody. It's never been reported as a threat. Its activities are not reported. I mean, the fact and what it does to its own people is not reported. Hanging gay people from cranes, locking up dissidents, murdering people in and out of prison, the oppression of women in Iran, not reported. It's extraordinary. Consequently, the Iranian people have been effectively deserted, abandoned. And they are people that we should be supporting to the hilt. So I can only watch these brave people making their protests and now, attracting live fire with very mixed feelings. On the one hand, it's terrible that people are being fired at, and that's going to get worse. On the other hand, it's crucial that it does get worse. It's crucial that the people of Iran continue to rise up because with that and with the pressure being put on by America, That's the way you can destroy the regime. And, you know, the idea of the fact that to this day, Britain and the EU are doing what they can to support the regime, to continue to trade with it, to continue to support the Iran nuclear deal, that to me is unconscionable. Eventually, presumably, the rubber's going to hit the road. Eventually, they are going to have to make a decision. What President Trump is effectively saying to them is, you want to trade with me in America? You can't trade with Iran as well, either or. And even more interestingly, it would appear that Saudi Arabia may be saying that too. Saudi Arabia has had sharp words against, against Mrs. Merkel in Germany. Saudi Arabia is saying to Mrs. Merkel, what are you doing? Trading with Iran. You want to trade with us? You trade with us, not Iran. In other words, Britain, you're going to be given a choice. Trade with us or America. To trade with us in America or Iran. Trade with us in Saudi Arabia or Iran. You can't have both. We'll see what happens. We'll see what choice they eventually make.
Following that line of thinking, I think it was last week was a huge success, showing the continued U.S. President Trump pressure that it was India who was a huge purchaser of oil from Iran, and they buckled to Trump's pressure and said, "Okay, we will stop buying Iranian oil." Which, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's another huge step in the process of putting pressure on the Iranian Islamic regime.
Yes, it is another huge step, and let us hope and pray that this actually works, that the regime is brought to an end. But when and if the history of the world comes to be written, I say if it's ever written by people who actually understand what objectivity is, but that's another matter. When the history of the world is objectively written, the role played by Britain and Europe at this juncture will be one of shame. It will be equivalent to the 1930s appeasement of Hitler. It will be seen in that way, as the free world doing everything it could to suppress freedom, to abandon people fighting for their freedom, and to appease and thus empower genocidal, fanatical religious lunatics who wanted to destroy the Jewish people in the Second Holocaust and wanted to destroy the entire free world. It will be seen in that way.
Wow. Melanie, thank you so much for your insight. It is always a pleasure. Anyone who is not following you, if you're watching, please go visit melaniephillips.com. Sign up directly for Melanie's articles and obviously purchase her books. Melanie, thank you very much again.
Thank you, Avi, and thank you to everybody for watching and listening.
Take care, everyone.